Hi everybody, greetings from a rather miserable day here in Cape Town. Oh, the sky is overcast, the clouds are hanging low, it's been raining on and off, torrential downpours, and there's a chilly bite in the air as though the wind is blowing straight off the South Pole right onto the city. Yeah, it's a pretty miserable day. Normally, I would stand at the door of my factory and look out across the countryside to some mountains in the distance, but today they covered in a mist, and there's signs of more rain on the way. So yeah, well, it is winter, and this is known as the Cape of Storms, so it's living up to its name. I thought we'd get back to our series on history, early Rhodesian history. And I think that if I had had the opportunity of investing money in Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company, by the beginning of 1894, I would be a very worried man. The gold that was supposed to lie in abundance in Mashonaland, another Witwatersrand if you like, had failed to materialize. Conditions were very tough. There'd been a terrible rainy season. Prices were very high for the settlers. And there was a lot of unrest in Zambezia. The Matabele had not kept to their part of the bargain. They had not stayed on their side of the border between Mashonaland and Matabele land. In fact, raiding parties of their warriors had gone as far north as the Angwa River, disrupting the work of the company. And it had got to the point where these raiding parties with impunity just descended upon the Fort Victoria area and started slaughtering the servants of the Europeans before their very eyes. And this was too much. It had to be brought to a stop. Law and order had to be maintained in order for commerce to continue. And so the Matabele War was started. And at the end of 1893, the company was victorious, and it was able to disband its men and send them back home again, back to Fort Victoria, back to Salisbury, or wherever they had come from. So on the surface, it looked as though things were good, but they weren't. The company was nearly bankrupt. There was no gold in Mashonaland. Everybody said, well, perhaps now, having subdued the Matabele, the company could look for gold in Matabele land. And I'm afraid that I, as an investor, would have been very dubious about that. I'd heard it before, and there was no reason to believe that Matabele land would be any more profitable as a business venture than Mashonaland. And of course, people would say, but Courtney Salou himself says that there's gold there, a lot of gold, and that's where most of the gold is in Zambezia. And I would have replied with respect, Mr. Salou is a great hunter, that is acknowledged. He's a wonderful musician, that also we know, and he's a very good journalist. But sir, Mr. Salou is not a mining engineer, and I would be thinking now, is the time come for me to just cut and run? Well, the company was aware of this sort of sentiment, and they were faced with a problem now. What could they do? They had ventured all on that war. It had cost them a great deal of money, but also it had almost ended in tragedy. Had that war been lost, I think every white person in that country would have been massacred by the Matabele. And I think everybody at the time believed that as well. So what about the future now? I would be thinking as a businessman. Yes, the Matabele appear to be subdued. but there was still a very large remnant of the army running around in the bush, and who certainly didn't feel as though they had surrendered. So there was this security situation. So what do we do? Do we go back to Mashonaland and sort of dig ourselves in there? What are we going to do there? There's no gold there. We're going to turn to agriculture. It has its own problems. As Moody said to Cecil Rhodes, I can get any number of farmers for you to settle on the land, and we can develop the country like that. But these men are in South Africa, and they are capable men, yes, but many of them have debts here that they have to settle before they could come to Rhodesia. Others again would need money to have their wagons repaired, or even to buy wagons to undertake this arduous journey. So, sir, do you have money that you could give these people? And Rhodes's reply was, I don't have any. His pockets were empty. So, the idea of sort of changing the agricultural perspective of Mashonaland overnight was not going to happen. So there was problems in that area. There were problems too that many of the troopers on the pioneer column had been promised farms, and when they had retired from company service, they were entitled to farms of 3,000 acres, but the condition was that these farms had to be occupied. Now, many of these troopers had got the notion in their heads that it would be better to actually go mining on an independent basis and make their money that way rather than through farming. And so these farms would be left unattended, and the company could not countenance that. And they said, unless you occupy the land, we can't give it to you. We'll have to take it away from you. So there were issues there as well that would concern any investor. How to get people onto the land and how to keep them there. The infrastructure was non-existent. The roads, such as they were subjected to rivers rising and cutting off communications. I mean, even in my day, some of you folk listening to me would remember traveling to South Africa by car and coming to a river and finding it flooded and having to camp on the side of the river and wait for it to subside. And it was even more so in those days. Tremendous problem. So what could the company do? Pull out, tell itself, well, we had a go. We thought there was gold there. There's no gold. So let's just call it a day. But that would have been exceedingly difficult. Apart from any sort of legal complications, I mean, they had a mandate from the imperial government to administer the country, I think until 1923. So there was a legal obligation to stay there and to see this thing through. But apart from that, the minute that they had they decided to pull out and leave the country, I think the Matabele would have immediately rose up in arms and pursued them and tried to stop their retreat and to wipe them out. So there was that issue, and of course, what would happen had they been successful and left the country intact with their lives and their property? What would have happened? Immediately, the Matabele would have started raiding the Mashona again. Thousands of Mashona slaves that had been freed through the Matabele War would have found themselves at risk again of being recaptured by these warriors and being taken back to Bulawayo. That was a very real possibility, and not just a possibility, but it was probably a very strong likelihood. And then there were the Portuguese. Had Rhodes pulled out of the country, they would certainly have immediately reoccupied Manicaland and probably pushed into Mashonaland as far as the Onyani River, which they always claimed was their territory. And then there was Kruger. One couldn't dismiss him at all. With the departure of the British, he would have immediately stepped into Zambezia and taken that over. And there were ideological reasons why the British couldn't allow that. Well, certainly Rhodes couldn't. I mean, he was no crusading saint. He was not sort of motivated by religious convictions or anything like that, but he did feel that the African was a person deserving of respect, and certainly someone that should be uplifted to what we would today call Western standards. And this was not entirely, shall we say, the objective of the Boer people. So we leave it at that. I'll touch on this a bit more when we get round to talking about the Jameson raid. But let me just say that there is a great difference in the thinking of the white Rhodesian and the thinking of the white South African. It's not to say one is right and the other is wrong. I'm not trying to say that. It's just that the perspective on life, their viewpoint, is not the same. They are very different. So Rhodes would have had a problem on that level too, allowing the Boers into the country. He would have been concerned for the future of the blacks. And then there was a sentiment in those days, and this was perhaps the most compelling thing of all. And it's best summed up in a phrase which is posed as a question. Is the job too big or the man too small? I haven't been able to find the origins of that. I have a feeling that I read it in a foreword in a book written by Sir Percy Fitzpatrick. I think so. But that was many, many years ago. But certainly the notion that, hey, here's a job that needs to be done. I'm not doing it. Is it because I'm not capable? Is it too big for me? Or am I too small for the job? Now, no self-respecting person wants to say to himself, I can't do something. I've got to do it if it's got to be done. And so to pull out there, out of Zambezia, would be like leaving a job half done. The company went there, yes, to find gold, but it also went there to uplift the African. Colonialism was fueled by such sentiments, and the job hadn't been done. So it wasn't an option to pull out. Rhodes and his company had to push ahead. And that meant bringing the whole country up to a standard that was world class, and do it quickly. Now, we have to bear in mind that the country was administered not by some political organization or institution. It was administered by a commercial company. Now, if you are working for a commercial company and your boss allows you to lounge around in the passage and not do your work and just to be a slacker in general, well, good for you. You're very lucky to have such an employer. But the BSAP company wasn't such a business. So yeah, they had a country. It was a wilderness. It was filled with superstition. It was not technically advanced. It had no infrastructure. It was insecure. A lot of work had to be done, and done quickly. Besides which, that Matabele War had to be paid for. The money spent on that, which was considerable, had to be recovered. And where was it going to be recovered from? I think it was only a decade or two ago, unless I'm mistaken, that the war reparations for the First World War were finally paid off. It took nearly a century to pay that off. Now, in the 1800s, as far as the Matabele were concerned, you had a war, you went on a raiding party against the Mashona, maybe you lost a few assegais, maybe you picked up a few assegais on the way, maybe you lost a few lives. Okay, that just added to the glory of the expedition. I mean, at least you could come home and say, there was some danger in raiding the Mashona. I mean, so-and-so got killed and so-and-so got badly wounded, but I have survived, and I've brought back some cattle and some women and some children, which are going to be my slaves. So, that was the cost of war. But modern warfare is not like that. I mean, when that Maxim gun is pounding away there, hundreds of rounds a minute, and there's several of them firing, and Nordenfeldt guns and field cannon are going off every time, it's boom, it's money. and it costs a lot. Oh, you know, in recent days, if you watch the news as I do, when I have the opportunity, and I see the devastation of that war there in Europe, and I think, man, who's going to pay for all of this? These buildings that are just ruined and wrecked, they are beyond repair. What do you, even if you conquer a land like that, what are you going to do? Where's the money going to come from to rebuild it? So, modern warfare is a very expensive business. And it was as expensive in 1893, comparatively speaking, as any war is today. So now, the company's broke, that war has to be paid for, the shareholders need to be satisfied. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? The only resource in the land is cattle. There are cattle and there are people. So you've got an abundant supply of labor, if you can get them to work, and you've got cattle. Now at that time, you know, we may think it's the 1800s, it's kind of primitive and there wasn't much science and so on, but veterinary science was quite well advanced. And at that time, as I understand it, the beef industry worldwide was largely dominated by the South Americans. And they had got to the point where they bred very fine cattle for meat. So here we had these, shall we say, rather scrawny, not good looking, but to their credit, very hardy animals in Matabeleland. Some 200,000 of them, if my memory serves me right, from what I remember reading at one time. And that was the only resource that could be used to pay for this war and to help, toward the funding of a new nation. So herein lay the problem, you see, because when the white man looked at these indigenous cattle, I mean, you couldn't compare them to a properly bred steer from overseas that was intended to be slaughtered and, the meat to be used. These animals, you couldn't compare them, but there were plenty of them. And so the Matabele were made to understand, listen, you guys, you got to pay for what went on, eh? You know you did wrong. You crossed the borders. You started killing the Mashona people when we told you not to, and you had agreed that we could undertake mining operations, and you would not interfere with those operations. And for us to do that, we had to employ labor, and you've come and you've disrupted that whole thing. So I mean, it is your fault entirely that this war's taken place. Now, we're going to have to get you to help toward the cost of that. And, to begin with, to be fair, the Matabele said, yeah, we understand that. What do you want from us? And they said, we want some cattle. Okay, we take cattle from the Mashona, you take cattle from us. Okay. Now, here comes the problem in getting them to understand how many cattle the company wanted. Now, you have to bear in mind that in those days, people were not educated as we are today. We tend to take our knowledge, our skills and our abilities very much for granted. But there was a time when people got through life without the knowledge that we have. And as far as the black man was concerned at that time, arithmetic was not a real big issue. I mean, a man could look at his herd, and without having to count them, he'd know if there was one missing, because he knew them so well, each one individually. Of course, not when it was in a herd of hundreds of cattle. That would be a little bit preposterous to suggest that. But generally speaking, their arithmetic would consist of counting on their fingers. Chipiri, Chitato, Shishano, or whatever it was, and on like that, and until you get to 10. And then when you got 10, you would go, that's 10, that's 20, that's 30. Now, for a person whose counting ability is at that level, You can well imagine that when you start saying, look, we're going to be taking about 130,000 head of cattle of yours. That's what we've calculated you people can afford. I mean, that is an unreal number to, the concept. It is so abstract that they could not get their minds around it. And so to begin with, they were very happy. Okay, yeah, come along, you want some cattle, we understand that, help yourself, do whatever you need. But now, I have said how the white man viewed this resource. But let me just say that from the black man's perspective, he had a completely different viewpoint when it came to the value of a beast. Cattle to him, in the first place, was a measurement of his dignity. An African who owned no cattle, I mean, it is almost unthinkable in that day and age. You haven't got any cattle? Not even one cow? No. And, this would be met with absolute shock. It was almost unheard of. I mean, everybody has got cattle. I mean, when you get to a certain age, your dad will give you some of his cattle to get you started, besides which you can go and work for somebody, do something, and they will give you a heifer or two, depending on what you've done. But you can start building up a little herd of your own, surely, but you've got no cattle. So your status in society was measured by the number of cattle that you had. And the more cattle you had, the more esteemed you were amongst your fellow human beings. So that was the first thing about cattle. They weren't just things that ate grass and that you slaughtered and that you cooked and ate. And then they served as money. There were no coins, there were no notes in those days. If you needed something, maybe some tools or something, and there was another man in the village who could, perhaps manufacture these things for you, you would trade what he has for a cow or two, depending on what the transaction consisted of. So you could use your cattle as a means of trade. And then when the time came for you to get married, you would have to pay something called lobola. And the Africans in those days had a saying. They may still have it today, I don't know. And it goes along these lines, that a man cannot have children, only a cow can have children. And you think, now, well, that's very strange. What is the meaning of that? Well, it means you can get married. Yes, certainly, you can have your wife and you can have children. But legally, they are not yours until that lobola has been settled. Now, the lobola might be, 10 cows, 12 cows, 15 cows, 20 cows. It depends very much on your standing in the community and that of the girl. In my time, all right, if an African man wanted to marry, say, for example, a girl who was a nurse, which was considered to be quite a high up job for an African lady, her father would expect a lot more than 10 cows. And as I said, in my time, some of them would be walking cows, which would be real cows, and some would be cash cows. So you'd have to pay the equivalent. But at any rate, those cows meant that you could get married and you could have children and that they were legally yours. They didn't belong to the bride's family. They were your kids because you had settled the lobola. Now, it would happen sometimes in the factory where I worked that a man would fall asleep at night on night shift and not pay attention to what he's doing and catch his finger in a machine. Perhaps in an unguarded gear or something like that, which of course shouldn't be there. But our machines were built in the old days. And the first thing he would do is, he would go home and go to what we call a nanga to go and find out why he got injured. It doesn't matter what the occupational health and safety officer says about unsafe conditions and unsafe acts leading to accidents and all of this kind of thing. You're not interested about in that. Why did my finger go into that part of the machine? What happened? And then the Nanga will come back to him after meditating and looking into the matter, and he'll say to him, there is a certain cow which has not been paid by your ancestors. Now, so a man in those days would pay for lobola, that would be so many cows, but now the mother-in-law has to get a cow of her own, and the father-in-law has to get some gifts as well. In my day, it would be a jacket and other things, a trench coat, highly prized. But now the Nanga would say, there's that cow that hasn't been given by your ancestors to a certain mother-in-law. Well, they've all died, they're no longer in existence. But the injured man would take this so seriously that he'd go and purchase a cow and put it on a truck and have it taken to that village that the Nanga has spoken to him about, and go and apologize to that family and have the cow delivered. Well, of course, they're not going to say, we don't know what you're talking about, go away with this animal. They'll say, thank you, yeah, we're very grateful that this matter has been settled between the families. That's in a modern context. But in those days, yes, cow was very important. So it had a sort of a spiritual aspect to it as well. And then it was also used in religious ceremonies, not so much, but there were times when it would be necessary to slaughter an animal. Okay, ancestors need to be reminded from time to time that the people do care about them, that they do remember them. So they'd have a party, slaughter a couple of animals, everybody would come and just have a big celebration. So there was that side of it as well. But to an African, a cow wasn't just a cow, something that, as I said, walked around and ate grass. So when the decision was made that they got to start rounding up these cattle, the company fully expected some resistance. And not wanting to keep calling up the men who should be on the farms and the mines, as they did during the Matabele War, they started recruiting black policemen and started training them to be the law enforcement arm with the BSAP of the British South Africa Company. Now, Sergeant Major Harry Geddes of the RDR explained to me what had been handed down to him by word of mouth of the kind of training that took place in those days. Now, you've got to bear in mind that these would be Matabele warriors and Shoners as well at a later stage, who many of them could not even speak English. So it was no good the instructor putting them on the parade square, lining them up, and then barking, by the left, quick march, left, right, left, right. What Harry told me was that they would actually tie a piece of string onto one ankle and some grass onto the other ankle. Now that they understood, you see, so they would now be marched, and instead of saying left, right, the instructor would say, Uchani tumble, Uchani tumble, Uchani tumble. And then the man would know, Uchani, grass, and he'd put his foot forward, tumble, the string, cord, and put that foot forward. And so in this way and in this fashion, these men were trained and became a disciplined force. And they would accompany the officials around to round up the cattle. And these would then be herded together and driven to the abattoirs in South Africa. Modern day critics make a big thing about the fact that these cattle were sold cheaply. And they draw this picture of this band of marauding looters, mercenaries from the company, ranging far and wide throughout the land, stealing cattle, just plundering the place. But it's not true. These animals were collected in an orderly fashion. They weren't sold cheaply at the abattoirs. They were sold for what the company could get for them. And it happened, as I said, that these beasts were really no comparison to the beef that was available. So, the prices were not good. And then there was a limit. You couldn't go there with 200,000 head of cattle to an abattoir. there was a certain amount that you could take there. So the officials would come and they would collect the cattle, and the Matabele would say, well, that wasn't so painful, it's not as bad as we thought it was. And then a little while later, the officials would be back again and said, we've come for some more cattle. Oh, but you've already taken cattle. No, but that was only part of it. Oh, okay. And so another lot of cattle would go off. And then after a while, it became too much. They'd say, hang on, when does this come to a stop? And they'd say, well, you're nowhere near the figure that we calculated. And a lot of resentment started brewing up on account of this. And it didn't help when more or less at that stage, rinderpest swept through the land. And so you'd have officials trying to put down animals to contain the spread of this disease. And they would come to a village, and these people have just now seen, a herd go off to the company, and now the officials come and they start shooting perfectly healthy animals. What are you doing? I said, but there's disease. But where's disease? Our animals look fine. What are you doing? No, we have to cull them so that, the disease can be contained. And this also was beyond the understanding of the tribesmen. So you had, you had this going on, this this ferment beneath the surface, this growing resentment at the way that they were being treated by the British South Africa Company. Do you know what? I think I'm going to stop right there. I'm not going to go much further because, like I always say, I get to a point where I suddenly think, I feel like I've been talking like for ages, and these poor people are listening to this. So I'm going to just stop here, and we'll carry on the story from here. But the point I'm trying to make is that, there were reasons why things were done in a certain way. I mean, we were trying to build a country, a world-class country out of nothing. And this is the way that the company went about it. And, Rhodesia only lasted, it didn't even last a century. But by golly, I got to tell you that by the time it was handed over to ZANU-PF, it was a wonderful place, as everybody will attest. Really, 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 they all did a good job there. And it wasn't just the whites, okay? I am very saddened at times that mostly what we hear from my black countrymen and from the liberals around the world and the critics is that what was there was just the vestiges of colonialism and the trappings of colonialism. It wasn't. It was a country that was standing on its feet, that was self-sustained, that fed the nations around it, and it was done not only by whites, it was done by the blacks. So, the African people ought to stand up and say, hey, you whites can't take the credit for what happened over there. We broke our backs. You may have had the capital and you may have had the technology and the knowledge and so on, but I mean, we had the labor, and I would agree with that totally. Together, that land was built, and what a wonderful place it was. Hey, I'm going to stop right here. Folks, you take care, look after yourself. I'm out of here before the next storm breaks. So God bless you all. Cheers for now.